Are we fundamentally selfish? It has become almost received wisdom to say that humans are totally egoistic, only out for themselves, and that selflessness simply does not exist. But does this bit of cynical knowledge actually hold up to scrutiny? It is much more complex than it first appears. So today, I want to take you on a brief tour through the philosophical debate around egoism. Of course, this is only a taster of what's out there, but I hope to convince you that it really is a fascinating question that we rarely do justice to in our popular discourse. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Naivety and Egoism. Let's begin with what I will call the pre-theoretic position. That is, the unreflective view that we often have of human motivation before we've thought that much about it. In short, this pre-theoretic standpoint suggests that we can in fact be motivated by things other than selfish egoism. An argument for this position might go something like this. I regularly find myself acting against my selfish desires. I sacrifice things for people. I act against my own interests by conforming to a moral system, even when it does not suit me in the moment. It just seems straightforwardly false to say that humans are egoistic when people often go out of their way to help other people. This is a very common sense view on things. We all have moments where we want to do something or think that something will bring us pleasure, but we refrain from doing it because of what we think is right or wrong, or because we care about another person. This can stretch all the way from not eating the last biscuit and giving it to a friend, to donating to charity, or even people who devote their whole life to combating poverty. On the face of it, all of these cases involve someone acting against their own interests in order to do something that is good for others. They are acting selflessly. Psychological egoism, in one way or another, attempts to reduce all of these motivations down to some form of self-interest. There are many, many different types of egoism, and we can't go through them all in this video, and they each have slightly different consequences. But the main distinction that I want to draw here is between a narrow or strong egoism and wide or weak egoism. Strong egoism is the idea that each of our actions is directly motivated by self-interest, in the sense that we genuinely intend any selfless actions that we do will eventually bring us future pleasures. That is, we follow moral laws because we are worried about punishment, rather than any kind of internal commitment to selflessness. We are kind to others in the underlying hope of a future reward, or because it is to our social benefit. We donate to charity so that we can boast about it to others. In a word, all of our actions are explicitly motivated by a wish to have some future reward or self-interested outcome for our own good deeds. We are only good because it is in our narrow self-interest to be good. And were external rewards taken away, we would cease to be good and also cease to intend good. This is a pretty ambitious thesis, and I would also say it is the least popular form of egoism around today. The trouble is that it's just quite difficult to square with both introspective experience and the observed behavior of others. It might well be the case that many people do kind deeds because they hope for some direct future reward, and they're actually intending at this direct future reward. But does this hold in every case? The person who embarks on a career in charity work is highly unlikely to be greatly rewarded for that in terms of money or social status, even if they become very accomplished in that field. Moreover, plenty of people donate to charities anonymously or choose not to shout about it. I personally know someone who volunteers at a soup kitchen for much of his free time, and yet I only found out about this because I bumped into him on the way to his shift. He had no desire to share his good deeds. For this kind of narrow egoism to be true, we would need to show that every case of supposed selflessness is explicitly aiming at some reward later down the line, and that this is contained within the contents of the intention behind that good deed. And this is a truly quite extraordinary claim. But before moving on, if you're worried about the intrusion of greed or self-interest into your newsfeed, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on Elon Musk threatening to support the opponents of those who vote for Trump's upcoming budget. While left-wing sources focused on the threat this posed to Trump, right-wing sources tended to frame this decision in negative terms, calling the move incendiary. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by the left or the right. This helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing an economist with a positive appraisal of Trump's tariff policies, or right-wing sources missing the potential 12 million people that might lose their health coverage under Trump's budget. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every article I read for bias. So receiving my Ground News Roundup at the end of every day means that I can get a variety of news opinions, learn which sources to trust, and just make the world less of a bewildering mess. Ground News are giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They've become my go-to news source, and I really hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. One piece of evidence that I often see cited in popular discussions to defend strong psychological egoism is that human beings are evolved creatures who are ultimately pressured to seek their own survival and reproduction. At first glance, it can seem like all of our behavior should be self-centered towards these goals. Even if we think that we're doing something because we care about others, we ultimately only do it and only intend it because it is in the interests of our survival or reproduction. That is the ultimate aim of all of our actions, and importantly, the ultimate contents of all of our intentions. We'll be coming back to this evolutionary point later, as it is very interesting. And do bear in mind this point about the contents of someone's intentions, as it's going to be very important for separating strong psychological egoism from our next philosophical beast, weak psychological egoism. Because strong psychological egoism isn't normally what people talk about when they're discussing psychological egoism as a plausible thesis. They normally have a much wider definition of self-interest and adopt what I will call weak egoism, or wide egoism if you prefer. This holds that while people do often seem to act selflessly and do not always explicitly intend for some reward from every selfless action, they are still ultimately just acting in their own interests because they either find this selflessness emotionally fulfilling or they would not be able to live with the guilt if they had acted in any other way. Thus, they are not truly acting selflessly. They are motivated by selfish internal pressures. It is just that these pressures are indeed internal rather than external, and they include things like emotional drives to help other people, and also these are drives sort of working in the background rather than the explicit object of the intention behind the action. This idea is very well illustrated by a probably apocryphal story about Abraham Lincoln. The tale goes that Lincoln was riding in his carriage with a friend one day, and he was giving his thesis that all human action is fundamentally selfish. As they are trundling along, they pass a sow and some piglets, drowning in the wet mud. Lincoln is appalled at this, and rushes to rescue the piglets and their mother immediately, ruining his expensive clothes and shoes in the process, a la Peter Singer. When he climbs back into his carriage, his friend tells him that he has just disproven his own thesis. He acted against his own self-interest here. To which Lincoln replies, "My good fellow, that was the height of egoism. I simply could not bear to let those piglets drown. I would have suffered immensely if I did not help." A great many broad egoistic arguments go like this. Whatever we think we are aiming at, all of our behavior is ultimately explained by alleviating emotional stressors and securing our own emotional well-being. When we act selflessly or even just morally, that is because we would feel so guilty not acting that way that it just outweighs any benefit we would get from behaving selfishly. Thus, what seems at first to be a totally selfless action is revealed at its ground layer to be just as selfish as the guy who extorts old grannies out of their pensions. The most famous proponent of this view was a philosopher, physician, and early economist named Bernard Mandeville, who thought that self-interest was both unavoidable and to be recommended. To quote from his most famous work, The Fable of the Bees, The humblest man alive must confess that the reward of a virtuous action, namely the satisfaction that it brings, consists in a certain pleasure he gets for himself. However, the neatest formulation I have found of this wide egoism is by Joel Feinberg, who expresses it like this. Psychological egoism is the doctrine that the only thing anyone is capable of desiring or pursuing ultimately, as an end in itself, is his own self-interest. This separates it from narrow self-interest and narrow egoism because it does not claim that people explicitly aim or intend their own self-interest in every selfless act, but rather that all of this selflessness ultimately cashes out in a self-interested end. That is, if you ask someone why they acted in a certain way enough times and they answered totally honestly, then they would eventually have to say that they acted in that way because it was in my best interest to do so. This is entirely compatible with people behaving in a selfless way on the surface. It doesn't mean that people will not devote their entire life to charity or help a friend in need. It's just that they will do this, ultimately, to satisfy some emotional drive, and it is thus self-interest at the ground level. This also doesn't mean that everyone is some kind of schemer. It is highly compatible with an extraordinary amount of altruism, and, as we'll note in the next section, this is arguably to its detriment as a philosophical thesis. As Feinberg notes, this is an incredibly popular idea about human behavior. It has found quite widespread adoption, not just among people like economists as well as some psychologists and some philosophers, but it is incredibly popular among the general population. And when people learn about this theory of broad or weak egoism, they often have a pretty visceral and emotional reaction. It often feels like their whole view of the human being is collapsing, and something vaguely more cynical is taking its place. This only makes sense. After all, they have gone from believing that humans are capable of selflessness to perceiving each and every person in the world as a perfect egoist, including themselves. It is perfectly reasonable to have a somewhat negative reaction to this. Though, as we'll see, this reaction might not be quite as justified as it first appears. This view has become so popular that many people treat it as if it is common sense and equate any disagreement with it with simple naivety. But this form of egoism has also come up against some pretty stiff critique, though that critique is of very different character to the challenges faced by strong egoism. And I would like to explore some of them now. 2. Against the egoist. When I was first learning about broad egoism many years ago, there was something about this overall thesis that struck me as vaguely fishy. I didn't necessarily think it was false, but there was something that seemed wrong with it. It was difficult to put my finger on, but I got the sense that this egoism was somewhat pretending to be more than it was. And the origins of my intuition here were found around 300 years ago in an Anglican bishop called Joseph Butler. Butler had heard about the egoistic theories of people like Bernard Mandeville, and I think he got roughly the same fishy feeling that I do. Butler got the sense that Mandeville's analysis was in some sense confusing the effect of a selfless or moral act, or some instrument by which it occurs, with the content of the intention to do that act, and that Mandeville's egoism was just much less impactful than it first appeared. A good example to illustrate this is the case of hunger. If we gave a roughly Mandevillian analysis of hunger, we might say something like this. It appears that when we are hungry, we desire food, but what we actually desire is the alleviation of hunger. In fact, we never eat food for food itself, but only the feeling of being full. There is a trivial sense in which this is true, but there's also a sense in which it is a deeply incomplete analysis. The food satiates our hunger because hunger is, in some deep way, a primal desire for food. For Butler, Mandeville gets the cart entirely before the horse. Yes, the motivational levers behind selfless action are contained within us and within our passions, and so to that extent they are self-interested, but we only take pleasure or avoid pain through the pursuit of selfless action because we have a desire to perform selflessly. This is just part of what a desire is, a state which causes frustration or pain when unfulfilled, and satisfaction or joy when it is fulfilled. The egoism Mandeville has proven is basically quite trivial upon further reflection. We can think about this further. What would it take for an action to not be egoistic under Mandeville's analysis? Even in principle, if some creature, be it human, alien, or animal, performs any action, they will be motivated by their own passions, and so they are behaving egoistically. The broad egoist did show that all emotions are egoistic, and thus all actions are egoistic, but only because they defined every possible action and every possible emotion felt by a conscious agent as egoistic. This usage of egoism has departed really quite considerably from our common sense usage of the term, so much so that to call the whole of humanity egoistic using this particular definition seems almost misleading. For Butler, to have a desire to help somebody else and thus to take satisfaction from helping that person just is to have a selfless desire, because its object is another person's good. This does not so much contradict Mandeville's thesis, but rather it just significantly takes the wind out of its sails. To use the Lincoln example, Butler would say that Lincoln is certainly not being selfish in his desire to rescue the sow and piglets. He will receive personal satisfaction when his desire is fulfilled, but the desire is fulfilled and the satisfaction springs forth by the well-being of someone who is not him, and therefore it is selfless or altruistic. To be selfless just is to desire another person's good. All the satisfaction communicates is that the desire is there. It is the means by which the selflessness is achieved. For Butler, an action would be selfish just if it had a selfish object. So, if I were to work to become very rich because I desired the state where I was rich and I thought it was good for me to be rich, that would be a selfish action and a selfish desire, because the straightforward object of my desire is a state that I think is good for me. This doesn't rule out that we can commit actions that look selfless but are secretly selfish. If I rescued someone from a burning building, not because I desired their well-being, but because they were extremely wealthy and I wanted them to pay me lots of money, then that would still be a selfish desire, even though I am helping someone. But if I wanted for them to be well, and I took satisfaction from the fact that they were well afterwards, for Butler, that would certainly not be selfish. We can use another thinker to further illustrate this point, the legendary Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume's views on egoism changed considerably over the course of his life. The philosopher Peter Millikan has done an awful lot of work on this quite recently, and I am basically about to summarize parts of his research for you, so thank you, Peter. As well as agreeing with Butler's critique, Hume points out that humans do contain a capacity for sympathy, and so this allows us to be motivated to help others because we often feel some of what the people around us feel, especially those that we care about. Although, as Millikan states, while this is against narrow egoism, it is still in line with broad egoism, as surely if we were not broadly egoistic, we would not need this sympathy in order to act selflessly. We would not need to feel what someone else does in order to act to their benefit. It does, however, help cement Butler's point that when we freely aid others, we are desiring their betterment and only indirectly attaining pleasure, rather than merely desiring the pleasure and only wanting to help the other person as a means to that end. Another of Hume's anti-egoistic points is that we often act out of kinds of instinct that actually have quite little to do with self-interest as it is traditionally conceived. His prime example of this is actually anger. When we're angry, we often desire to hurt someone even if we explicitly know it is not in our best interests. Likewise, when we love someone, we might act against our own interests in a borderline irrational fashion in order to make them happy. Many of us have done things in anger which we regret almost immediately. Surely, these seem like they're done not out of self-interest, but rather some baser, irrational instinct. This can also help explain phenomena like self-destructive behavior that is performed when in a heightened emotional state. Honestly, while I can't go into it now, I think that self-destructive actions are independently a very interesting objection to egoism. There is a sense in which we could modify Mandeville's thesis to incorporate these baser, irrational or irrational instincts, but in doing so, we only seem to trivialize it further. We could say that, in an angry state, the person must have thought that expressing the anger was more in their own interest than anything else, as otherwise they would not have done it. But this, again, just seems like it's defining self-interest as whatever we decide to do. Whenever we act, it then must be in our own interests, because we are acting in accordance with our emotions or instincts or passions, and thus via an internal, self-interested drive. But now, this really does just sound like we are defining ourselves into egoism. If every possible action is and always will be egoistic, then sure, we do have egoism, but it's an egoism entirely born from toying with words, without telling us anything substantial about how people actually act, think, or behave. We have, in effect, broadened our egoism so much that it just amounts to saying when creatures act, they are motivated to act, which is hardly the earth-shattering realization that egoism initially purported to be. Now, I do want to point out here that there have been many attempts to carve a middle ground between narrow or strong psychological egoism, which is highly controversial and mostly thought to just be outright false, and this very wide psychological egoism, which comes across as simply trivial. An excellent paper on this is Mark Mercer's In Defense of Weak Psychological Egoism, which, to quote him, is the doctrine that all actions are performed in expectation of realizing self-regarding ends, that behind any action whatever that an agent performs intentionally, ultimately, there lies the agent's expectation of realizing one or more of her self-regarding ends, an expectation without which the agent would not have performed the action. Note that Mercer's definition is subtly different to our former definition of weak psychological egoism. Here, although someone might be motivated to help someone else and not desire some direct return on investment, they nonetheless believe that they will be happier for having helped that person, be that in the form of alleviated guilt or sympathetic pleasure. This is not a trivial thesis, as if we did perform actions without believing that we would recoup this emotional reward, then the thesis would be disproven. In a way, the extremely wide psychological egoism that we discussed earlier in this section could not. The idea here is that no one will pursue a course of action if they truly believed it was against their long-term self-regarding ends. That is, if someone really thought that they would not feel guilty about making a selfish decision, and that decision was in their interests, then they would make that decision. By contrast, if someone never felt any kind of emotional reward for acting selflessly, then they would not behave selflessly. As long as we don't define emotional rewards to just mean something to motivate action, this hypothesis should avoid triviality. I think as far as definitions of plausible egoism go, this may be our best bet. It is still technically falsifiable and thus not totally trivial, but it's not obviously false either. It reminds me of Max Stirner, an entirely different kind of egoist, who charged Christians with needing a higher reward for following God's will in the form of heaven, and thus not being truly holy people. And I want to follow this thought a little bit further, because this connection between being selfless and being a good or moral person is an important emotional undercurrent through this whole debate, and it's worth exploring just how justified that is. Can we be weak egoists and still be good people? If you want to help me make more videos like this and generally support the channel, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel itself, or if you want access to exclusive content, to the Patreon. The links are in the description. 3. Egoism and morality. On the face of it, there is a very close connection between being selfless and being a good person. And strong or narrow egoism is very much in line with this intuition. If someone only ever acted with the explicit motive to get something out of it, then we would think they were a bit of a conniving bastard. Every action they took would be tainted by the fact that any selflessness was only really a side effect of their intentional aim. And I do think that a lot of the despair that surrounds theories of psychological egoism continue to trade on this underlying association that we have between egoism and a vague sense of evil. It carries the idea that there truly are no good people. But it's worth us asking whether this association actually works for the weaker and more plausible forms of psychological egoism. I will accept that it probably works for the strongest versions. In both wide psychological egoism and Mercer's weak psychological egoism, self-interest is a cause behind an action, but it's not the object of an agent's intentions. It can be true that Lincoln would not wade into that mud to rescue that sow, were it not for the fact that he would feel awful if he did not. But that doesn't mean that Lincoln merely desired to avoid guilt. He desired to save the sow, and the guilt, or the delight at saving the sow, were the mechanisms by which the desire made itself salient. This is a very different kind of picture to strong egoism. Lincoln still desired and intended to do something selfless. It's just that since we can only be motivated from the inside, the emotions, with their minimal form of self-interest, kicked into gear. It's sort of a peculiarity of parts of our current inherited value system that we sometimes consider it to be more virtuous to do a good deed while hating every second of it than to do a good deed and take an enormous amount of personal pleasure from it. My instinct was that this could have been a Christian idea, but there's just so much writing in both Catholic and Orthodox thought about the joy of doing good and obeying God's law. So maybe it's a Puritan thing, I'm not really sure, so I'll leave the question to a historian. But it's definitely floating around in our ideas about morality, at least in the Anglosphere. Historically, this is somewhat strange and definitely idiosyncratic. A great many religious and philosophical traditions actually take pride in the connection between morality and personal fulfillment. Just one example of this is the Buddhist concept of compassion, which involves not just feeling the pain of another person, but feeling joy at alleviating that person's pain, or when another person receives a boon. Theravada Buddhism connects ethical conduct directly to personal joy, with the underlying idea that it's all part of this broad process that moves the practitioner closer to nirvana and hence liberation. There is not this idea that self-love and love of others are naturally opposed. They are, in fact, thought to go hand in hand. Another good example is the Aristotelian system of virtue ethics, where the height of the virtuous person was not that they acted against their desires in order to force themselves to do good. This was simply a stage that someone had to pass through. The truly virtuous person, in Aristotle's framework, was someone who took pleasure in behaving virtuously. Indeed, part of his recommended education for young people is learning to take pleasure in virtuous things and to not take pleasure in vicious things. Aristotle's entire ethical system is based around the key concept of eudaimonia, a state of fulfillment and flourishing that virtuous people can eventually arrive at by dint of their virtue. And if we reflect upon it, we can see that many of our cultural examples of really morally good people are those who are seen to take personal pleasure in doing good. Take the archetypal good guy, Superman, who, in classic comics, not only saves people, but feels privileged to be able to save people. Or the kindly old mentors in 1,000 Stories, who find joy in teaching our young protagonists how to be skilled and how to be good. To act against your own self-interests, and thus to sacrifice for the good of another, is considered the height of morality. However, this is largely based on the narrow kind of self-interest associated with strong egoism, and is totally compatible with weaker egoisms. When a hero makes a noble sacrifice because they're just that passionate about doing the right thing, that internal passion seems like a good thing, not a bad thing. To use a religious example, in Christianity, a great instance of Christ's goodness is meant to be that he suffered unimaginable torments, you could even say excruciating, to redeem mankind. And traditionally, this is because he loved us so much that he would rather that than leave us as unredeemed. It is the same structure as the Lincoln example, but obviously writ cosmically large and divinely ordered. With all of this in mind, there is potentially a really quite optimistic interpretation of these wider kinds of psychological egoism. We can think about it this way. Instead of the emotional or existential framing being, aren't humans so selfish, at base level they only act in their own interests, we can put it in the following terms. Is it not marvelous that human beings can feel such compassion and sympathy for one another that they can take on each other's pains as their own, and another's interests become your own interests? This is perfectly compatible with altruism under weaker forms of egoism. Once we realize that the negative or cynical associations of weak egoism are largely based on equivocating the meaning of the word selfish and confusing it with stronger forms of egoism, we find that the picture that it paints of humanity is just as emotionally compelling and fulfilling as before, if not even more so. Rather than humanity being capable of reluctantly doing selfless acts, it means we are capable of joyously doing those same acts. Yes, there is a sense in which we are all self-interested, but only because we are so emotionally invested in the lives of other people and those we care about that we can't help but align our own interests with theirs, even when we're supposedly behaving altruistically. Mercer touches upon a very similar point in his paper, which I'll quote now. What is admirable in the person who sacrifices his life in assisting others is not that he acted rightly despite his inclinations, but rather that he was so strongly inclined to be concerned for others. I love this kind of philosophical development because it takes a potentially quite nihilistic or cynical conclusion and re-enchants it with nothing more than close analysis of what its actual logical consequences are. We ultimately find that the soft egoist picture of mankind is every inch as capable of what we intuitively call goodness or selflessness as the picture we had before. What could have been a world-shattering conclusion is revealed to not nearly be as bad as it initially seemed. There has been a lot of buzz around the concept of re-enchantment recently, and this is such a good example of that in action. This is one reason why I think it's basically always worth asking when you encounter any philosophical thesis that seems like it would have such wide ramifications, yet also seems vaguely truistic. What actually are the direct, fine-grained, detailed, inferential consequences of this view? Much of the upset caused by weaker egoist theories is that the inferential consequences are, at first glance, intuitively thought to be the same as those of strong egoism, when this could not be further from the truth. It is so easy to be fooled by similar labels when the actual consequences of strong and weak egoism are so very different that it almost seems strange that they go by the same name. But with all of that said, I want to zoom out a little and see just how this debate around egoism can become so very muddled. And I suspect that part of it is because we are conflating a whole bunch of different questions. 4 levels of egoism. Earlier in the video, we touched upon a brief evolutionary argument for strong egoism, that surely if we are evolved creatures aiming at survival and reproduction, then most, if not all, of our behavior should be eventually explicable by appealing to these pressures. There are already some problems with this argument as it stands, because it treats humanity as the perfected end of an evolutionary process, rather than just one step along the way of an ever-evolving process. We could have many psychological and physical mechanisms which are not perfected for survival and reproduction, because evolutionarily, we are not done yet. However, there does remain something compelling about this thesis, and it is worth exploring why. Another argument that I've often seen for egoism, even strong egoism, is that egoistic assumptions sometimes do work at scale. That is, if you're going to model millions and millions of people, sometimes your best bet to predict their behavior might be to treat them as, roughly speaking, totally strong egoistically self-interested. This is a classic view amongst many economists, though it is worth noting that it has received an awful lot of criticism in recent years, especially from behavioral economists. Both of these arguments are interesting, because in each case, using them to defend psychological egoism at the individual level is ultimately a mistake, but at the same time, they illustrate 2 very important things. The first is that 2 questions can sound very similar but be very different, and the second is that even the strongest forms of psychological egoism can still be useful in some contexts, even if they might not be, strictly speaking, true. Regarding the point about evolution, simply because evolutionary pressures mean much of our behavior should be explicable in very broad strokes and mechanisms in terms of these pressures, it does not follow that in the case of each individual action, they must also be explicable in this way. This sounds a bit technical, so it's best illustrated by example. It could be that we are evolved in order to behave pro-socially because we are much more likely to survive in groups than alone. In such a scenario, it may be in the long-term interests of our chances of survival and reproduction to genuinely evolve mechanisms that allow us to behave altruistically, such as the aforementioned sympathy or empathy. This does not mean that, when we act, we will always be acting out of explicitly selfish intentions, nor does it mean that we will never act against our own material interests in order to satisfy some of these other regarding emotional pressures like sympathy. Thus, the argument from evolution to strong psychological egoism ultimately fails. But this illustrates a very interesting general problem when we are inferring from broad evolutionary pressures to specific behaviors. Just because evolutionary pressures explain how we come to have our particular physical or psychological mechanisms does not mean that our behavior at the ground level is psychologically explicable by appealing simply to these evolutionary pressures. It may be true that I behave pro-socially because it was better for my ancestors' survival to be pro-social, but it does not follow from this that when I behave pro-socially, I only do so because I intend to survive and reproduce. This is a tricky distinction to get your head round, but it's absolutely vital for understanding when evolutionary arguments are relevant to a claim and when they might not be so relevant. If you want a particularly harrowing example of the discrepancy that can emerge between individual behavior and broad evolutionary pressures, you can check out the castrate sect of Christianity that had a brief surge in popularity in 19th century Russia. But be warned, I don't know if not safe for work is the right word. That makes it sound like it's going to be titillating, and it's definitely not that, but it is kind of horrifying. But anyway, back to the script. We can see a similar idea in the claim that if we assume even strong psychological egoism, we may be more able to predict human behavior at scale. Again, let's just assume that this is true, and I'm sorry to any behavioral economists in the audience. This does not necessarily mean that every individual person is also best modeled as a strong psychological egoist. There are trends that emerge at scale that just do not translate to individual cases. This point stretches much, much wider than simply the case of egoism. For example, if you were tracking a single particle, much of your observation of its movements would be taken up by its Brownian path, a kind of unpredictable movement that particles undergo as they bounce into other particles. I'm sure that a physicist in the comment section will let me know just how wrong my explication of the concept is here, but I'm going to run with it for now. However, if you were observing trillions of particles all at once, then it may make more sense to treat them as if they were a continuous fluid. You know that they're not, but it's the best way to predict their behavior. Moreover, that Brownian motion that was so unpredictable before now falls into relatively predictable patterns at large scales as the noise drops away. As you get bigger in scale, the individual idiosyncrasies of the particles decrease, and the whole system becomes so much more predictable. This is part of what can allow strong psychological egoism to still be useful even if it may be false. However, it is important not to get wires crossed here. Strong psychological egoism is still not considered capital T true here, any more than we disbelieve in the existence of particles when we begin to treat large collections of particles as continuous fluids. But it could still be our best bet to model human behavior at scale. Although, as I've said before, even this idea has come under fire more recently. So, what's going on here? Well, I think that when we talk about human beings being egoistic, especially in popular discourse, we're often running together a series of very distinct questions, which then makes the conversations around egoism much more difficult to have. At one level, we want to know whether the origin of human behavior is best explained by the self-interested pressures of evolution by natural selection. This type of self-interest could be construed as the self-interest of the individual organism, or the group, or even the gene, as in the case of Dawkins, for instance. That's where his book title, The Selfish Gene, comes from. This is an issue about how to explain the occurrence of certain psychological mechanisms we have that might at first feel mysterious, such as seemingly altruistic behavior. Where did it all come from, and did it all come from an originally self-interested place to do with self-interested pressures? At another, we want to know whether human beings themselves are only capable of self-interested or self-regarding action. This is a question about what, in fact, motivates humans towards certain behaviors and what the contents of our intentions might be. Within this question, we have various different theories, such as the pre-theoretic idea that we just are capable of altruism, to strong psychological egoism, to Mercer's weak psychological egoism, to the widest kinds of egoism, which border on triviality. Each of these have very different inferential consequences for our common sense view of humanity and morality. Importantly, the weaker forms of psychological egoism do not pose too much threat to our common sense moral norms. Weak egoism is still eminently compatible with the intuition that humans can be good or altruistic, as we use the term in our everyday speech. At yet another level, there is the question of what pragmatic assumptions we might want to make when we are modeling or predicting human behavior at scale or engaging with a human without knowing anything else about them. Machiavelli famously argued that although individuals were perfectly capable of being selfless and virtuous, it is better to treat people at scale, or if you know nothing about them, as if they are self-interested, since that will be the prevailing movement when you're dealing with large numbers of people, and if you don't know anything about a person, it's sort of all you have to go off. To what extent is Machiavelli right here? And if so, could we describe some kind of stronger psychological egoism as an emergent property of groups of people rather than a property of individuals? If this is true, it has huge implications for how we might want to conduct politics or social organization. And importantly, this is an empirical hypothesis. It can be tested. I think part of the confusion in our popular discussions around egoism is that all of these questions tend to just get packaged together, and then it is assumed that if even the weakest form of egoism is affirmed, this is a disaster for our conception of humanity. This makes discussing egoism as a topic just so much more difficult than it needs to be. Overall, the main thing that I hope this video has communicated is that the debate around egoism is a lot more complicated than it first appears. In fact, the question we posed at the beginning of the video, are humans fundamentally selfish, is probably quite an unhelpful way to frame the question. Instead, we can devolve it into a series of different questions about in what sense psychological egoism holds, where altruism comes from, and whether there are any changes in the type of egoism that we might consider true at an emergent level. Most importantly, this is a debate absolutely ripe for equivocation on key terms. It is so easy to jump back and forth between an egoism that is false but devastating and one that is true but trivial. So here is my tentative proposition for the egoism debate. To the extent that egoism is true, I suspect it is unremarkable. And to the extent that it is remarkable, I suspect it is not true, even if sometimes it may be a useful, pragmatic assumption. Have fun criticizing me in the comments. But if you want to check out another perspective on egoism, this time from an ethical and almost existential perspective, check out my video on Max Stirner right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.